This is the fifth and last part of today's session on vision and attention. Here we will look at neural measures of attention. A very important neural marker of attention deployment is the EndtoPC component that was first identified by Luck and Hilliard in 1994. They used a visual search task where participants in some blocks, the ones on the left-hand side here, had to look for a color singleton. So they had to indicate whether there was a red bar or not. So this would be a target present trial, and this would be a target absent trial. In other blocks, they had to look for an orientation singleton. So a horizontal line would be the target here. And then here, this would be a target absent trial. Now, importantly, they presented the targets laterally. So this allows comparing contra and ipsilateral activity in the EEG signal, in the event-related potential or ERP of the EEG signal. So what this means is basically, for example, if you have the odd element, this doesn't necessarily have to be a target if it's the block in which they, for example, look for orientation, but just have a look at this odd element which is presented in the left hemifield here. Then contralateral electrodes would be those electrodes that are in the right hemisphere. So if it's presented on the left side of the screen, contralateral means right on the scalp, and ipsilateral means left on the scalp. And then, of course, if you present the odd element in the right hemifield, it's the opposite. So what did they find when they looked at the ERP as a response to the onset of that search display? What they found was that there was indeed a difference in the processing of the target between the ipsi and contralateral electrodes, namely the electrodes contralateral to the target, the solid line here, the stroke line here, or dotted line here, was more negative than the electrodes ipsilateral to the target, the solid line. Remember that negative is plotted upwards in the EEG world. So we see a difference in the processing between the ipsi and contralateral hemisphere, but what does it reflect? Is this really related to attention? Well, because this could also be just, the physical imbalance. So after all, there's an odd element on the left side and not on the right side. So maybe is this just reflecting the different physical appearance? Well, if you look at the same physical displays in a block where they had to look for an orientation target, it becomes clear that it is more than that. So again, this is the exact same physically exact same displays here, but there's no EndtoPC now because this trial stems from a block in which they didn't have to look for color. So this indeed argues in favor of the EndtoPC reflecting attention deployment, because here they indeed had to attend the target. Here there was no target. This was a distractor as well, a non-target, so they didn't have to attend it. So that suggests that the EndtoPC is indeed reflecting attention deployment towards task-relevant items. EndtoPC, by the way, stands for a negativity in the time range of the N2, the second negative peak, and it's called P because it's most prominent at posterior electrodes, and C stands for contralateral because it's contralateral to the attended hemifield. So how can this EndtoPC be used to measure attention deployment? I would like to give you an example from my own research. This is a study from 2011 where we wanted to look at how threat-related stimuli are processed. So we compared happy faces with angry faces. This is a visual search task, and participants were instructed to say whether there was a target present or not, and the target was defined as a face showing a deviating emotion. So in this case you have 5 neutral faces and 1 happy face. In another trial you might see 5 neutral faces and 1 angry face. So first we had a look at the behavior, and we did find that there was a better search performance for angry faces. So this somehow suggests that there's an advantage, but is this really due to differential attention deployment? In order to answer that question, we needed to look at the ERP elicited by the faces, and when we compared angry face targets with happy face targets, in both cases we found an EndtoPC, which is not surprising because after all they did attend the target to some extent. But as you can see, the EndtoPC is larger for angry face targets than for happy face targets. It's also appearing a bit earlier in time. So what these results suggest is that there's more and earlier attention deployment towards targets when they are angry, when the target is an angry face. And this might indicate that threat-relevant stimuli get attentional priority, which, for example, might have some evolutionary advantages. Fast threat detection, fast attention deployment towards potential threats could be life-saving in some instances. So we have talked about how certain relevant items are selected, and this is indeed reflected in the EndtoPC component. But attention is not just about enhancing relevant information, but also about the withdrawal of resources from irrelevant information, which is also termed suppression. So both prioritizing the relevant and ignoring the relevant are supposed to contribute to the the most efficient attention deployment. To give you an example, in a real-world example, if we're at Times Square and our target is our friend that we want to find, and we know that our friend wears a blue shirt, then we would probably try to focus on all the blue items, and all the distractors would be, for example, the cars, the billboards, and so on. So what we should do ideally is focus on our friend, focus on blue things, while at the same time suppress those locations that are unlikely showing our friend, because our friend cannot fly, so everything up there might be irrelevant. We might also suppress the cars because we know that yellow is not important, and so on. So both the enhancement of blue and the suppression of, for example, yellow or anything up here would help our search for the friend. Here's another example from the Lego world. So imagine we have these Lego bricks and we want to build a Batmobile. Then here we can find the target maybe with certain efficiency, but here in this example, when we have a salient distractor, then maybe our attention deployment is impaired because resources are going to the irrelevant item just because it is very salient. Remember that in guided search and other attentional theories, physically distinct stimuli get a lot of priority on a retinotopic representation of our visual environment. So it's not necessarily the target that gets all our attention first if a distractor is particularly salient. So again, this is a real-world example, more or less. In the lab, we work with much more abstract geometric shapes, and the competition between such irrelevant salient items and less salient but relevant items, like this black Lego brick here, was simulated in the so-called additional singleton paradigm that was developed by Jan Teeuwes. Here the task would be to find the diamond and report the line orientation. So in this case they would have to report bottom right orientation is the line has a bottom right orientation. And in other trials, you would see that in addition to the diamond-shaped target and the relatively easy to ignore distractors because they are the same color but a very different shape. In addition to those, there is an additional singleton. This is a color singleton because it's the only element with that color. That makes it very salient. And a common finding in these visual search tasks, the additional singleton paradigm is also a visual search task, is that in trials in which you have this additional red item, you have singleton costs. So this reflects involuntary capture of attention by irrelevant information. The irrelevant information being this salient distractor here. And what we see here is two processes. We have top-down processing, which is reflected, or which is, for example, attention deployment towards the diamond here, and we have bottom-up processing, which is the salient, the processing of the most salient item, the salient distractor here captures attention. So one of the challenges really for our visual system is to coordinate the top-down and bottom-up processing. And if you know there will be something yellow, the visual system can actually prepare through active suppression. So the idea would be you're expecting this to appear here, the salient distractor, and then what you can do through suppression is make it less likely that this receives any processing. And there's actually empirical evidence for that, for active suppression. This is a study by Arita and colleagues. In this visual search task, participants had to search for this kind of shape, so either a U or an inverse U, and they could ignore all the U's that were oriented to the left or right. So in this example, this would be the target, and all the other things here would be distractors. Now, prior to the onset of that visual search display, there was an aid provided to the participants, namely a positive cue. So this cue here would indicate in which color the upcoming target will be. So as you can see, the target here is red, and this cue would indicate which color to attend. So this would help participants to focus on anything red and not even attend blue items altogether. And then what you can see is this benefit here. So if you have a neutral cue, that would be like no information about the upcoming cue here. And you have a positive cue, so this is the positive cue informing you about a feature of the upcoming target. You can see that the cue actually helps. Preparing for red as a relevant color does help. Now, they also used negative cues, and negative cues would prepare a participant which items will be irrelevant. So here, participants, what they could do is they would know that this is a negative cue, so they would be able to prepare to not attend anything blue, and indeed this is a correct cue because the target was not blue. And then what you see here is what the authors call a suppression benefit. So basically what you see is that the performance is not as good as with positive cues, but still there's a difference to neutral cues. So it does help to prepare through proactive suppression of blue items when you know blue is going to be irrelevant. And in experiment 1, they used 3 colors. So this is important because one could argue, imagine you only use 2 colors, then if you know the blue is a negative cue, instead what you could do is recode that information, say, oh okay, then red must be the relevant color, and use red as a positive cue. But if there's 3 colors, you can't do this. What you could do, of course, is if you get a blue negative cue, you could say, well, okay, that means that the target must be green or red, but in a follow-up experiment they also used 7 colors and replicated the results, and it's very unlikely that a participant would, instead of using, in this example, blue as a negative cue, they would build up a target template of 6 different colors. So in sum, what this study shows is that negative cues can be used to suppress irrelevant items proactively, and the variation with the 7 colors suggests that they are actually using blue as a negative cue rather than recoding this and using a positive cue that consists of 6 other colors. So one more time, a positive cue would result in the enhancement of relevant information, whereas a negative cue would result in the suppression of irrelevant information. Now, can we also find a neural measure of that suppression, just like the EndtoPC reflects target processing or attention deployment towards relevant items? Imagine a scenario where you have a target here and the salient distractor here. So what we might observe is then a contralateral negativity to the target reflecting attention deployment towards the target. And if we compare some condition with another condition and see that the EndtoPC is increasing. Now the problem is that we cannot really say that this is necessarily more attention towards the target, because it could also be less attention towards the distractor. Because a negativity contralateral to the target is tantamount to a positivity contralateral to the salient distractor. So the EndtoPC can be isolated, the EndtoPC elicited by the target can be isolated by presenting the salient distractor on the vertical midline. Because now all the negativity that we see here contralateral to the target must be due to the target. Because the lateralized ERP, the lateralized EEG signal, is blind to anything on the vertical midline. So again, this doesn't tell us anything about suppression. So if we want to know something about suppression, for example, of the salient distractor, we need to swap the location of the target and the distractor here. So in this case, we would have a salient distractor here and a less salient target on the vertical midline. And again, the same logic applies. We have anything on the vertical midline should not affect the lateralized ERP. And what we find then is an EndtoPC contralateral to the salient distractor. So even a distractor can elicit an EndtoPC because it captures attention automatically. This is also in line with many attentional theories that assume that something salient can be attended even though it is not relevant to us at the moment. But importantly, after the distractor EndtoPC, there is something found which is called the PD component. PD stands for distractor positivity. It's a positivity contralateral to the distractor compared to ipsilateral sides, and the PD is reflecting suppression of irrelevant information. So first we have attentional capture by the salient item, and then later it is suppressed. To summarize the ERP components typically observed in a visual search task, when you have a lateral target and the distractors on the vertical midline, like here, you would find the pure target EndtoPC that reflects attention deployment towards the target and nothing else. If the distractor is presented laterally and the target is on the vertical midline, you would normally see a distractor EndtoPC first, here, and then a PD. And the PD reflects suppression. Does the PD really reflect suppression? Well, this was tested by us in a study that was published 2 years ago. In this task, participants saw search items like these. So the task for participants was to report the digit inside the diamond and ignore all other digits. This was a mask just to make the task a bit more difficult. And in some of the trials, in addition to the not so salient gray distractors and the target here, there was a salient singleton present, a color singleton, and that could be blue or red or green. And in addition to that, the singleton could be presented laterally. So this is the case here. The target is on the vertical midline, the distractor is presented laterally, and here it's vice versa. So what you would expect is, in these trials, you would expect a PD component if there is suppression going on. Here you would expect an EndtoPC because the salient distractor is on the vertical midline and the target is presented laterally. So first we replicated earlier results showing longer response times when there's a singleton. That was not a big surprise. But interestingly, the report frequency of the different digits also told us something about what was going on at the different locations in the visual field. So when the singleton was absent, participants most of the time reported the target digit. So this is the green bar here, and these are the correct trials. And only in around 14-15% one of the other digits was reported. When the singleton was present, also most of the trials were correct. So maybe 28% or so of the trials, participants reported the correct digit, which in this case would be the 4 because it's in the diamond. Now the critical comparison here is regular distractors and salient distractors. Digits in regular distractors were reported more often than digits in these salient distractors, suggesting that the salient distractor was actually suppressed below baseline, the baseline being neutral distractors. So because we know red is irrelevant, we can suppress it, and this would help us to not attend the wrong location, but rather attend the target right away. So behaviorally, this is a replication of a previous study by Gasperlin and colleagues. But what we also did is we had a look at the PD component as a function of whether participants reported the correct target identity, the distractor digit, or the singleton digit. So here you can see the target lateral trials, and you can see that there is an EndtoPC elicited by the target. But there was no significant difference in the EndtoPC between the conditions. So similar attention deployment towards the target in trials in which the correct and incorrect digit was reported. There was also a larger CDA when the target digit is reported, which indicates a more stable working memory. But we will talk more about the CDA component in the next session, so for now you don't need to consider this further. Now the most critical comparison for us was trials in which the singleton was presented laterally. So the target was here presented on the vertical midline, not affecting the lateralized ERP. And then what we compared was trials in which the target was reported, a distractor was reported, or the singleton was reported. And as you can see, there was no early PD when the singleton was reported. So the red trials here, the red line. You can see there's no PD here, no positivity contralateral to the distractor here, when eventually the singleton was reported. And there was also a larger CDA elicited by the singleton, indicating that the singleton was actually encoded into working memory. So the most critical result, just to summarize this one more time, was if the PD really reflects suppression, then failed suppression of irrelevant items should result in an incorrect answer, and this is exactly what we found. There was no PD here, and the red curve indicates no PD, and indeed, because it's the red line, we see those were trials in which they ended up reporting the incorrect item, namely not the digit in the diamond, but the digit in the red circle. But if there was, if the PD was relatively large here, for example the green line here, then there was apparently sufficient suppression going on so that the irrelevant item could be ignored and only the relevant target item in the diamond could be attended. So attention-related research questions that can be answered with these EEG components, the EndtoPC and the PD, are, for example, how does visual priority change over time? So this would be something like a priority map or retinotopic representation, just like in guided search or saliency map models that we've talked about earlier. And then we can use these ERP components to measure how much attention a certain stimulus gets at a specific time. We can also determine which factors determine visual priority. So which item wins the race for attentional selection? Is it something related to emotion, to physical salience, reward, current goals, or maybe something like familiarity? So that was it for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and next week we will be talking about memory.